Affairs. This evening, we continue our Indiana Council on World Affairs Great Decisions 2026 series. This is the second of the 8 sessions to be presented during the coming 6 weeks. Great Decisions, published by the Foreign Policy Association, is the basis of national discussion by groups around the country and here in Indiana. The book can be ordered at educational discount from indianaworld.org. This evening, we'll be talking about Trump 2.0 foreign policy as a way to examine what some would say is the transition from liberal internationalism to an America First renegotiation of global economic, political, and security relations. Let's hear what this evening's speaker has to say about this. And here to introduce Dr. Pierre Atlas is Dr. Betty Tonsing, Indiana Council on World Affairs Vice President for Programs who, with council members, has organized this Great Decisions 2026 series. Betty has served abroad for more than 15 years in prestigious assignments, such as a Fulbright Scholar in Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East, and has traveled extensively abroad. Dr. Tonsing.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's here. We have one of our more popular presenters this evening. Pierre, I want to tell you, I had a very dear friend who missed you one time, and she may be on this evening. She probably is. She said, "You didn't tell me that Dr. Atlas was going to be speaking." So you have like what's it called? A groupie? Is that what the name is of the rock world? Fan world. We really have one of our more popular speakers this evening. And if you're new to our programs, you're going to know why shortly into it. Dr. Atlas is really a profound lecturer. He will not put you to sleep. He is well informed. He's a fabulous presenter, deep in the facts. And I think it's going to be a fascinating topic because it's one that we're now 1 year into. And as one commentator said fairly early on, America first. Does that mean America alone? And according to Bad Bunny, if you watch that on Sunday night, America is much bigger than just America. And if you think about it, when we think of America, we also think of the United States. And so Bad Bunny reminded us, no, it's really the broader view. But we are going to look this evening. And so Dr. Atlas is going to lead us through this complex discussion, and it is complex. Trump 2.0 foreign policy. Dr. Atlas is a comparative political scientist by training. He teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in both the public affairs and criminal justice programs for the O'Neill School at Indiana University, Indianapolis. Prior to joining the O'Neill School in fall of 2021, Dr. Atlas was a professor of political science at Marian University. Dr. Atlas devoted much of his academic career to studying and writing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When he does those programs, those are also fascinating. You can see all of his programs on our YouTube channel. U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and other conflicts and conflict resolution. More recently, his comparative research and publications have examined historical and contemporary political differences between the U.S. and Canada on issues such as indigenous policy, the role of government, gun laws, and gun culture. Dr. Atlas writes a monthly opinion column for the Indianapolis Business Journal, and before that was an opinion columnist for the Indianapolis Star for 16 years. He's a native of Texas. If you follow him on his social media, you'll see him often in a cowboy hat, his cowboy boots, and his cowboy belt, which he loves wearing. He grew up in California and is a U.S. Army veteran. He holds degrees in political science from Rutgers, University of Arizona, and the University of Toronto. So Dr. Atlas does not need a moderated discussion. He likes to be able to present. And so you're in for a good 45 minutes of really good material. So welcome, Pierre. Please take it away.
Thanks, Betty, for the very nice introduction. Yeah, so let me go ahead and share my screen. So let's do that first. Hang on a second. It'll take a second. Okay, and let me see here, one more thing. Okay. All right. Can you guys see this? Okay, very good. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, I've got a presentation, and I will go through that for a few minutes, and then afterwards we'll have Q&A. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of things that I'm not going to cover that you'd like to cover in the questions, and that's totally fine. So basically, this is what I'm going to be discussing tonight. First of all, as Betty said, I'm a political scientist. I've spent years teaching both comparative politics and international relations topics. And so I'm going to bring in a little bit of international relations theory and concepts into this discussion, which I think are important. And for those of you who have read the chapter in the Great Decisions book by John Eikenberry, who's actually a very, very well-respected international relations scholar, I'm going to be using some things that you would be familiar with, plus I'll go beyond that as well. So first of all, I'm going to cover some perspectives on foreign policy and international relations, and those are realism, idealism, and liberal internationalism. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the main topic of of the the talk for tonight, the rules-based liberal international order. And as you guys know, if you have the book, you know it. If you don't have the book, you might not. But the title of the actual chapter for this presentation in Great Decisions this year is called "Debating America's Global Role: America First versus Liberal Internationalism." And so I'm going to really talk about liberal internationalism and the liberal international order a little bit, drawing from Eikenberry plus my own stuff as well. And then I'll spend a bit of time sort of analyzing Trump's second term foreign policy from the perspective of what's gone before. And then after that, we'll have the Q&A. Okay, so let's get rolling here. So first of all, let's go through some perspectives on American foreign policy and international relations. And again, these different approaches are called realism, idealism, and liberal internationalism. And I'll go through each one in turn. So realism, for those of you who had any political science or international relations, you're familiar with this term. It's also referred to as realpolitik. You might have heard that as well. And realism focuses on the national interests of a country. That's the priority, is pursuing national interests. So according to realism, states must prioritize and pursue their own national self-interest. This is the primary thing. This goes back to Machiavelli and others as well. From a realist perspective, the main focus is power, especially military power, or what we would call hard power. Having power enables a state to pursue its national self-interest to protect those interests. To quote Hans Morgenthau, who was one of the deans of realist theory after World War II, he said, statesmen think and act in terms of interest defined as power. From a realist perspective, morality and values really should not be a factor in foreign policy. And again, this kind of goes back to the Machiavellian tradition. Rather, countries should build their alliances based on shared interests and not necessarily on values. And we've seen this, the United States has done this in the past. The United States has supported non-democratic regimes that were deemed to be in the American national interest. Certainly during the Cold War, the U.S. supported a lot of governments that were not democratic because they were anti-communist and against to hold off the Soviet Union as part of the Cold War. There was actually a term back then called ABC, anything but communist, and that justified that. And then we also see in the non-Cold War context, or at least today, the United States has had very strong positive relationships with Saudi Arabia from 1945, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt, up until today. In every presidential administration, the U.S. has seen the Saudi relationship as very important to America's strategic interests, uh, really largely disregarding the fact that Saudi Arabia has one of the most abysmal human rights records of any country in the world. Some presidents have stressed human rights a little bit more than others, but in general, that has really not stopped the U.S. from having this very strong relationship because of oil, because of Saudi Arabia's strategic position, a lot of other factors as well. Another approach that is juxtaposed against realism is what we call idealism, and specifically American idealism. And American idealism is really a product of American exceptionalism, which goes back to the time of the colonial period. The idea that America is like a light unto the nations. It's special. It's anointed. It has certain types of values that really America should lead with. And so, whereas realism focuses on interests, idealism focuses on values and on American values in particular. So from this perspective, in foreign policy, the United States its policy should be fused with morality. American values and ideals, including democracy, equality, human rights, should be prioritized even over national self-interest in some cases. So an American idealist would actually stress human rights and wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't be cozying up so much to Saudi Arabia. Perhaps supporting non-democratic governments would not be in the best long-term interest of the United States because it goes against our values. There's always been a tension between realism and idealism in American foreign policy. I'll talk about that a little bit soon. Where we see idealism most famously was with Woodrow Wilson, and he explained why was America getting into World War I, as to quote Wilson, to make the world safe for democracy. That is very much coming out of the idealist tradition. Bruce Gentleson, who is a respected, I think he might have passed away recently. He may be still alive. A very well respected international relations and political science scholar, put it this way when discussing idealism: in the long run, right makes for might, rather than might making for right. That if you're doing the right thing, you can actually increase your power over time. So there's this sort of this debate, right? Idealism also stresses what is known as soft power. And soft power is a concept that was coined by another political scientist named Joseph Nye. And he defined it this way: the ability to entice and attract based on our values. If the United States represents values that others want to follow, it will cost us less to lead. So we have hard power, our military power, our economic power, but we also have soft power. And the soft power really does come from the values of a country. And a lot of countries have soft power. Some countries have more soft power than hard power. Canada, Norway, Denmark are countries that don't have a lot of military power, but they have a tremendous amount of soft power, and that's there's a value to that. In addition to realism and idealism, there's also a concept called liberal internationalism. Sometimes it's called liberal institutionalism. And liberal internationalism stresses cooperation between states, between countries, especially cooperation between democracies. And rather than focusing just on pursuing self-interest in a narrow way, basically, liberal internationalism stresses international institutions and the idea of rules and norms of behavior that can foster cooperation, the advancement of human rights, global trade, economic interdependence, all of which can reduce chances of conflict. So basically, from a realist perspective, realism focuses on competition between states. Liberal internationalism focuses on cooperation between states. Liberal internationalists would point out that we live in an increasingly interconnected world, and that although American global leadership is certainly in the national interest from a realist perspective, the United States has in fact created an international institutional framework, which I'll talk about in some detail, of rules and norms of behavior that is actually larger than the sum of its parts, and that it goes well beyond just the narrow U.S. self-interest, but in the long term, it is in the strategic and economic benefit of the United States. And so this is sort of, again, another kind of debate there's a tension and debate between realism and idealism, and there's also sort of tension and debate between realism and liberal internationalism. From a liberal internationalist would point out, and you've probably seen the bumper sticker, global problems require global solutions. Climate change, pollution, HIV/AIDS, transnational crime, human trafficking, international terrorism, all these types of major global issues do not respect the borders of sovereign states in the international system. And states alone acting out of their own self-interest really cannot deal with these transnational and global issues. But the norms and rules of behavior, international institutions and organizations are what can help. So global solutions often do involve international institutions and agreements. So for example, climate change, the Paris Agreement, which frankly both Trump administrations pull out of, but those are things that sort of come out of this framework of liberal internationalism. So when we're looking at the relationship between realism and idealism in American foreign policy, and this is something I've stressed in my writing and in classes over the years, it's really important to understand that we've never seen a case where American policy was purely realist or purely idealist. American foreign policy, going back to the time of George Washington, has always been an admixture of elements of realism and American idealism. One approach in a particular era or particular context is stressed or prioritized over the other. Okay, but we've always seen both. All right, and I would argue that when American foreign policy has been most successful, it's taken place when both American interests and American values are in sync. And the classic, probably strongest example of that is World War II. when it was an American national interest to defeat fascism and liberate Europe. And it was also totally consistent and forwarding American values to defeat fascism and liberate Europe and Asia as well. So these were really World War II was sort of both realists and idealists completely in alignment in a sense of what the war was about and a very successful foreign policy. During the Cold War, although from a perspective, as I said, the U.S. supported some non-democratic and unsavory governments, and frankly, the U.S. also helped to overthrow some democratic governments that we were afraid might actually be not too pro-American, whether it was in Iran or Guatemala or Chile, some other places as well. At the same time, there were times during the Cold War when the United States had both its values and its interests very much in sync. And that was really aiming at the Soviet Union and Europe in terms of stressing the values of freedom, the Helsinki Accords, Helsinki, things like that, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, very much in alignment. I would also say more recently that the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, with when President George H.W. Bush was in charge, that also was a really good example of both interests and values being in sync. From a realist perspective, we did not want to see Saddam Hussein get his hands on Kuwaiti oil and perhaps even Saudi Arabian oil, and alter the international system of sovereignty. From an idealist perspective, the idea of a powerful country invading a smaller country, annexing it against the will of the people, that certainly went against American values. So really, there was a very, and this was a war that was actually largely popular in the United States, in large part because realism and idealism lined up fairly well. It fell apart perhaps, but it very much in a recent time. Also, the United States was able to get much of the international community to support it as well. So it had very, very strong global support as well. Now, idealism and liberal internationalism, on its face, you might say, wait a minute, these sound very similar, or they certainly go together. And that usually is the case. Very often, internationalism and idealism go together, but not always. And I want to sort of bring in a couple of examples here. Going back to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is both the poster child for American idealism and for liberal internationalism in American foreign policy. Again, make the world safe for democracy. He received the Nobel Peace Prize for the 14 points, which was his vision of sovereignty and self-determination and rights for a post-World War I world that he wanted to see happen, and the concept of the League of Nations. All of that was both very much in line with American idealism and liberal internationalism. I have an asterisk by Wilson because Wilson was an amazing person. He was the only actual political scientist to become president of the United States, but he deserves an asterisk, frankly, a big one, because although he was very progressive on a lot of policies, he was a white supremacist who resegregated the federal civil service and basically injected racism into government policy in that sense. He also was an inspiration indirectly for the creation of the second version of the Ku Klux Klan when he showed Birth of a Nation in the White House. There's a lot of stuff that kind of unsavory about him. At the same time, on the international stage and in a lot of domestic policy as well, he was of tremendous influence and really advanced a lot of American interests and values forward. Anyway, so Wilson is definitely someone where you see American idealism and liberal internationalism really going hand together and fitting very well. But then we get George W. Bush and the Iraq War. And Bush, his goal was to spread democracy via regime change. I was on a panel many years ago with someone, and we were talking about it was during the Iraq War. I basically called George, he was a Wilsonian idealist, which definitely was the case. And a person on the panel with me said, actually, is Wilsonian idealism on steroids. And that really was sort of a very muscular Wilsonian idealism. At the same time, though, with the Iraq War in particular, George W. Bush was not a liberal internationalist because, frankly, with the invasion of Iraq, he ran against some allies like France and some other countries that did not support the U.S. going into Iraq, and there were actually UN resolutions opposing it, and he ignored all of that and went unilateral. So in this case, he was definitely a Wilsonian idealist in the idea he genuinely believed in spreading democracy, but he did it in a way that was completely unilateral or tried to unilaterally. So this is a case where liberal internationalism and idealism did not go together. So I just want to sort of bring that into context. Okay, hang on a second here. What I'd like to do for the next few minutes is sort of dig into Eikenberry and look at the rules-based liberal international order. This is the post-World War II order that was largely created by the United States and led by the United States. And really, the question is what has happened to it now? But we are talking really about 80 years of American global leadership in terms of strategy, democracy, economics, a lot of different types of things, and liberal institutions as well. What Eikenberry does is he identifies five specific elements of the liberal international order, or the LIO. And I want to go through those five elements. I think this is very useful. Again, the United States designed, built, and led the LIO. And as Eikenberry points out, this has been a system grounded in rules, norms, and multilateral institutions, which, as he says, facilitate cooperation, creating avenues and resources for states to grapple with the complex problems of interdependence. And this was, again, the creation of the Bretton Woods organization, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, GATT, which becomes the World Trade Organization. All of this basically establishes the mechanisms for global trade and interdependence, for economic development. The United Nations itself, which was a brainchild in large part of the United States. Organizations like the World Health Organization, the International Atomic Energy Association, informal organizations like the G7, which is the seven largest democracies, or seven major democracies that are very important. And it's informal, but it's an institution. All of these things are all part of the kind of the rules, norms, multilateral institutions that exist. That's the first point that he makes. The second point of the LIO is formal alliances for security cooperation. And this is really interesting because the security cooperation is a way in which realism's focus on national self-interest gets linked to the liberal international order. Okay, and a classic example, of course, is NATO and Article 5, which is the collective defense article of the Charter, which says an attack on one country, one member state is an attack on all member states, and that really held off the Soviet Union for decades, and basically prevented a third world war in Europe, which could have happened without NATO. As Eikenberry puts it, security alliances are constitutive of the larger community of like-minded democracies. An example of this in action is the European Union and NATO, including the U.S., at least under the Biden administration, fully supporting a democratic and sovereign Ukraine when it was invaded by Russia, an invasion that completely violated all of the norms and rules of the liberal international order. And Putin has basically fundamentally challenged the LIO with the invasion of Ukraine. And it really is sort of a battle for the future of the liberal international order. It's also a battle of really an authoritarian regime versus democracy in Europe. And so it's a very big deal. We can talk about that in the Q&A if that's something that interests you. Number three, a rules-based world economy based on open trade, which also links countries together for peaceful relations, is a major aspect of the LIO. To quote Eikenberry again, the United States over the last 80 years has based its claim to global leadership on the sponsorship and promotion of this open trading system. And globalization has benefited the world. It has brought more than half the world out of abject poverty. Of course, it creates winners and losers, and there's a lot of issues with globalization. I talk about it in some of my classes. We look at this in great detail. But the economic system that we have had for the last 80 years is unlike anything in the history of humanity, and in very positive ways. And this was made possible by the rules, norms, and institutions economic that were largely created and led by the United States. And other countries have bought into it, making it much larger than the sum of its parts and larger than just American leadership. Number four is a commitment to democratic solidarity with the United States as the leader of the democratic world. And this has been a critical element of the liberal international order since 1945. To quote Eikenberry, the defense of liberal democracy and the protection of human rights have laced the rhetoric and actions of the U.S. administrations. And this goes all the way from Franklin Roosevelt and Truman to Reagan and the post-Cold War presidencies as well. This has been an important aspect that we've seen both Democratic and Republican presidents, Democrats and Republicans in Congress supporting it. Obviously, there were different elements to it. Some things were stressed more than others depending on who was in power, but this has been a consistent element. Okay. I would also add, this is not mentioned by Eikenberry, but it's an important thing in international relations, is the concept of the democratic peace. And this is basically an axiom, really, of political science today, that long-established democracies have never gone to war against other long-established democracies. Frankly, it is inconceivable that Japan and the United States, who fought an incredibly vicious war in World War II, would actually go to war against each other. Or France and Germany, that fought many wars against each other, would ever go to war against each other. It's their democracy, it's the norms and institutions of democracy, the interdependence, multiple factors. It's been studied. Democratic peace has been studied and tested in great detail. But this also is an aspect of this commitment to democratic solidarity, and it is a post-World War II aspect that is very, very important. And by the way, liberal internationalism can explain the democratic peace. Traditional realism cannot, because traditional realism would say that basically countries should only be pursuing their interests and not their values. And frankly, if you have a serious conflict of interest with a democracy, why wouldn't you go to war? Liberal institutionalism and liberal internationalism really helps explain and understand the democratic peace. And then finally, the last point, last element of the liberal international order that Eikenberry discusses in the reading for this for the Great Decisions book this year is what he calls the norm of strategic restraint by the United States. And this is a willingness, to quote Eikenberry, a willingness to abstain from the abusive and indiscriminate exercise of power, particularly towards its allies and partners. And Eikenberry himself admits in the reading, and if you read it, you saw this, that the United States has a mixed record on strategic restraint, but he notes that in general, it is held. And this idea that America has this hegemonic power, and it has had for decades, for 80 years, but it really did not use it in an arbitrary, aggressive way, the way great powers had done in the past. And that's the point I really want to make here is that such restraint by hegemonic power is really unique in the history of the world. And again, I mean, going back to the idea of the United States rebuilding the countries it vanquished, Japan and Germany, and turning them into democracies and moving forward from there. Obviously, the United States did a lot of aggressive things, a lot of wars. As I'm not saying it's perfect, and neither is Eikenberry. But this idea of this norm of strategic restraint is another important element of the LIO. So basically, this gives us everything I've just covered. Sort of gives us sort of a framework and a baseline for looking at and analyzing Trump's foreign policy. And from international relations theory, political science, a little bit of a history as well. So now what I want to do for the rest of the talk is really go through a discussion of Trump's foreign policy, and then we'll open it up to questions. I think it's first important, just very briefly, to go over Trump's first term in terms of foreign policy. Okay, I think it's pretty clear, and a lot of people who study this would agree. And I think Eikenberry makes the same point. In Trump's first term, he actively sought to undermine and dismantle the liberal international order. He denigrated the United Nations constantly, as well as other multilateral institutions and international norms. He reduced America's participation in the UN agencies and other international organizations. He withdrew the United States from the World Health Organization. It was during the pandemic, but withdrawing from it basically took us out of the game, and was very detrimental, I think, to public health in the United States and elsewhere. Again, rather than trying to reform things, the idea was we're going to take our marbles and leave, and that's very different from the way presidents dealt with this with the issues for 80 years. Trump sought to dismantle decades of, frankly, bipartisan supported free trade agreements and replace them with protectionism and what we call neo-mercantilism. He ended NAFTA and replaced it with USMCA, which we'll talk about in a minute. And at the time, he negotiated USMCA, which he made the argument that it was better for the United States, and arguably it could have been. He called it the world's greatest trade deal. As we all know, President Trump is very, very into making deals. And frankly, the deal making, I think it matters more to him than what the deal actually results in. The idea that I made a deal, he gets to say that, and he said that with USMCA, at least back in his first term. Trump repeatedly insulted and rhetorically attacked NATO as an institution. He also attacked specific NATO members, and these were our longstanding allies. He also questioned openly whether the United States would abide by Article 5, which is the critical element of NATO, and even mused at the idea of pulling the United States out of NATO. And it was apparently one of his goals, had he won in 2020, one of his goals was to actually try and pull the United States out of NATO. That did not happen, obviously. In addition to that, Trump also rhetorically insulted and attacked our Asian allies, Japan and South Korea. He suggested that the United States might not defend them unless they paid for their defense. It was very much of a quid pro quo transactional. If you're not paying us to defend you, we're not going to defend you. Again, very much different than the idea of a collection of democracies, of shared values, of even shared interests. It was a much more of a what have you done for me lately kind of thing. Very unusual. Um, what was also really unusual was that while, as he insulted America's democratic allies, he publicly praised authoritarian dictators, particularly Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. And even very famously in Helsinki, I believe it was 2018, President Trump actually openly standing next to Putin took the side of Putin over the American intelligence community. And at the time, Dan Coats, who was the director of national intelligence, former Indiana senator, actually just a few days later basically came back and kind of said, no, actually the intelligence community is correct. Russia did try and interfere in the 2016 election. And Putin basically is lying. And he said, I stand by everything the intelligence community said. And this was a very conservative former Republican senator from Indiana, Dan Coats, as DNI, basically rejecting what the president had said. And then not long after that, Coats left as DNI. But this was in the first term, you had people who were willing to actually say, no, Mr. President, you're incorrect. I would say that Trump's bromance with Putin, which we saw in the first term and it's continued now as well, and his sympathy for Russia's foreign policy agenda, along with his open disdain for America's traditional allies and their democratically elected leaders, was truly unprecedented in American history, either from Republican or Democratic presidents. This was really quite shocking, and we'd never seen that. It led me to pen a column for the Indianapolis Business Journal back in 2020 entitled America's First Pro-Russian President. Okay, let's move on to number two, the second Trump term. And I'm going to bring in Eikenberry a little bit more, and I want to actually tell you who Eikenberry is. I think it's important to sort of know. His full name is G. John Eikenberry. He's a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton. He's co-director of Princeton's Center for International Security Studies. He's the author of 6 books on international relations. He's been named one of the top 10 scholars of international relations in the world by his peers. He also, in the first Bush administration, served on the State Department's policy planning staff. So, and he wrote the chapter for this session. And I'm going to quote a couple of things from him that I think are useful. Opening up, looking at his evaluation of Trump's second term, he says in his first year in office, the Trump administration, Trump 2.0, has turned world politics upside down on issues including trade, alliances, foreign aid, climate change, international law, human rights, and cooperation among liberal democracies. President Donald J. Trump, under the banner of America First, has made sharp breaks with the long post-war tradition of American foreign policy. He goes on to make a really important point, and that is in international relations theory, especially from the realism perspective, there's a distinction between what we call a status quo power and a revisionist power. He doesn't actually use these terms, but he hints at it. The status quo power are the powers that have been there for a long time, and they are the ones maintaining the system. Okay, the United States has always been seen as the status quo power. Revisionist powers are rising powers that try and challenge the system. China is considered the major revisionist power today. Okay, Russia is also one as well. But basically, what Eikenberry is suggesting is that the United States itself has, under President Trump in the second term, has turned from the world's primary status quo power into a revisionist power itself that threatens to upend the international system. And to quote Eikenberry, he said, what makes this revisionist shift in American foreign policy so surprising is that great powers do not typically seek to destroy their own international order. It is historically anomalous to see the world's most powerful state actively attacking its own post-war creation. And then in his conclusion, jumping to the end of his chapter, I wanted to quote a paragraph from his conclusion. The Trump administration is redefining America's role in the world. It entails a departure from a broadly liberal internationalist approach that has guided U.S. global leadership for 80 years. The old and long-standing pillars of the American global position, alliances, international institutions, open markets, democratic solidarity, hegemonic restraint, in other words, those 5 characteristics, are weakening or disappearing. Within the larger global system, the norms, institutions, and relationships that have served to stabilize world politics are weakening as well. Great uncertainty exists about the future. That's Eikenberry's take. What I'd like to do basically for the rest of my talk is I'd like to go through my analysis of Trump's foreign policy as well. First of all, I think it's really important to understand that Trump's America First approach is not as isolationist or as inwardly focused as was promised in the 2024 election. And this is why a lot of people in the MAGA movement are actually quite upset with what Trump has been doing in foreign policy because this is not what they were talking about. He said, we're not going to get into forever wars. We're not going to be involved in military events. We're going to inwardly focus. We're going to be building jobs, restore the economy, those types of things. All right. Instead, Trump has shown himself to be quite willing to either aggressively threaten or to actually use military force abroad. And there are already several countries, about 6 or 7 countries, that Trump has used military force against, either whether it's just missile strikes and bombings to actual, as we know in Venezuela, removing the president of Venezuela and basically taking over the country in one form. I would argue that Trump's foreign policy is neither realist nor liberal internationalist, nor idealist. Donald Trump is the first post-war president of either party who has not promoted democracy abroad. This was the case in his first term as well as in his second. He doesn't even use the rhetoric of promoting democracy. Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, who had diametrically different views on foreign policy, both stressed democracy and American values. They were both idealists in many ways. And we don't see, and every president, every single American president from 1945 until Trump, not including Trump, but including Biden, but every single president, Democrat and Republican, has always stressed democracy abroad in some form. Instead, I would argue that Trump is eradicating America's soft power by eliminating USAID, and actually hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people might die because of this. But not only in terms of that, but just this was America's way of demonstrating its values to the world and building that soft power that Joseph Nye talks about. By gutting the voice of America, by banning travel of people to the United States who actually, frankly, foreign exchanges and bringing in foreign students was a way for decades for the United States to build its soft power. And I will say, as someone teaching at a major university, we are seeing a massive decline in international students coming in to the university in terms of because their visas are not being granted and they're not even bothering to apply. So all of those students are where are they going? They're going to Europe. They're going to Canada. And these kinds of things. America is losing the opportunity not only to express itself abroad with soft power, but to bring people into the United States who would then go home and spread American values, which is frankly one of the ways in which the United States won the Cold War. Trump used military force to remove Venezuela's dictator, but he has kept its authoritarian regime in place rather than support its opposition leaders in order to secure oil deals for the U.S. companies who also happen to be major donors to the president. Overthrowing a regime or overthrowing the president and keeping the authoritarian regime in place is not spreading democracy. It's not the regime change that George W. Bush was seeking, for example. Venezuelans want democracy, but Trump doesn't seem to be interested. Rather, to quote Donald Trump himself, I will run Venezuela. Trump told the Iranian people, as they were literally in the streets being killed by the regime, protesting the regime, and now the estimates are maybe 6,000 Iranians have been killed. He said just a few weeks ago, help is on the way, suggesting that the United States is going to leverage its power, including its massive carrier strike forces in the Persian Gulf, to try and put pressure on Iran to ease up on its people and perhaps allow for more freedoms. But rather than doing that, what Donald Trump has been focusing all of his attention on is trying to get a deal with the regime itself on nuclear weapons. And so help is on the way. The Iranian people are not going to be benefiting. Again, where's America's soft power, American idealism? Those kinds of things are out. And it's very problematic. And I think a lot of Iranians, in the end, if the United States cuts a deal with the regime that enables the regime to stay in power after we promise to help the people, we're just going to have another generation of Iranians not liking us very much. In Venezuela and Iran, as I said, both repressive regimes, Trump seems to be more interested in making deals with those regimes than in supporting democracy or human rights. Now, you might say that this is realism focusing on national interests, but I wonder if that's the case or if the motives are really more personal. Is it about looking out for the donors in Venezuela for oil and America's oil interests? And is it also part of President Trump's quite openly stated desire to win a Nobel Peace Prize? I don't think that what we're seeing today is really consistent with traditional understandings of realism. Oh, that's certainly something that we could talk about. Continuing on, I would argue, and certainly Eikenberry does too, that Trump's America First approach is undermining all 5 of his characteristics of the post-war international order. And frankly, Eikenberry mentions this, but I've been saying this for a while now, that Trump seems to be taking the United States not to the post-war era, but to the 19th century, with the 19th century balance of power geopolitics, where the world was divided by great powers into spheres of influence and even empires. And I think that is sort of where Donald Trump would like to see the United States go. But I have to say that that era of balance of power, great power politics collapsed at the end of World War I and continued to collapse through World War II and basically ended at the end of World War II and was replaced with the liberal international order. Um, Trump has openly advocated U.S. dominance over the entire Western Hemisphere. Um, uh, Basically, he's dusting off the Monroe Doctrine from 200 years ago, and he has modified it, and he calls it the Donroe Doctrine, making sure he gets his name into it, just like he likes to name a lot of other things. His rhetoric and policy goals have included, literally from the day he became president, forcing Canada to become what he calls the 51st state. I have to say, as someone who studied Canada and also did my undergrad at University of Toronto, and I wrote a column about this last year, Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories and a population of 40 million people. And if Canada were to become part of the United States, you would probably be adding 10 new states, perhaps 13 new states. Each state would get 2 senators, as well as members of the House of Representatives. And frankly, it would not be and probably most of them, if they voted for American parties, would vote for Democrats, not Republicans. I mean, the idea of Canada as a 51st state, it makes for a pithy bumper sticker, but as policy, it's kind of ridiculous. But at the same time, he's been using a lot of tariffs and other things to browbeat Canada to try and force them into this. Obviously, he also wants to seize Greenland to take it away from Denmark or from the Greenlanders themselves. He has talked about reneging on the Panama Canal Treaty and taking the canal back. As we see, he wants to control, or he is controlling Venezuela's oil revenue, and he's been threatening Mexico, Colombia, Cuba, and other states in the Western Hemisphere. Um, all of these violate the principle of sovereignty and also the right to self-determination for the peoples who happen to live in those countries. And both of those, both the principle of sovereignty and the right to self-determination, are critical elements of the post-World War II liberal international order that, again, the United States helped create and lead. Another real point of concern is this great power spheres of influence approach has been openly undermining our alliances, both in NATO and in Asia. And it really is suggesting that perhaps Russia's sphere might include parts of Europe and China's sphere of influence parts of East Asia. One of the questions is down the line, and some people have been raising this, is in exchange for basically the United States being allowed to dominate and control the Western Hemisphere without interference, would Trump be willing to sacrifice Ukraine to Russia and even sacrifice Taiwan to China? In both rhetoric and policy, then, Trump rejects or abandons the 80 years of bipartisan U.S. leadership in the international arena in the name of America first. But I would suggest that really this approach could make it America alone. Carrying on to bring in the economic sphere, the economist William Milberg, who's at the New School of Social Research, very well respected economist, looking at Trump's rejection of the liberal international order in all of its economic aspects, including an open free trade. He calls Trump's approach neo-patrimonial mercantilism. Mercantilism is protectionism, economic nationalism, as opposed to free trade and the market economy. But the neo-patrimonial refers to the idea that it's not out of state interest, it's out of basically personal interest, that you need to pay off the president in order to get favors. Trump does not seem to understand, I would argue, the free market principle of comparative advantage, that some countries make things that we cannot make and therefore we should import them, or frankly, how global trade operates. But rather, he sees trade as a zero-sum game in which most countries rip off the United States. Unlike previous presidents, including Republican presidents, Trump sees tariffs as a strategy and not merely a tactic. Moreover, he uses tariffs as a weapon for personal retribution against leaders or countries that he feels have insulted him. He uses tariffs to coerce countries to change their foreign and even domestic policies, and not just using tariffs to adjust their trade policies, which is how tariffs have been used in the past. Tariffs have been weaponized, but they've been usually used to, we will impose a tariff on one thing for you to lower prices on something else or to stop subsidizing or whatever. So, for example, President Obama imposed tariffs on Chinese tires to protect the American industry, but he was not imposing tariffs on China to get China to change its domestic policy or other types of things like that, or as a punitive way because China had insulted him. When it comes to trade, Trump is just as willing to weaponize tariffs against our democratic allies as well as our adversaries. And this again undermines U.S. leadership in the democratic world as well as our soft power. Canada and the European Union, frankly, are now openly looking to make possible trade deals with China as an alternative. They're actually looking for alternatives to the United States, which, frankly, a few years ago would have been unthinkable. I strongly recommend, if you guys are interested in this, there are two things that you should watch on YouTube. One is President Trump's 1 hour address to the United Nations General Assembly that was back in September. And he basically lays out his disdain for the liberal international order. His basically America is no longer going to be the leader of the free world. He insults basically every country in the room. But it's really quite something to see, and it's a full hour speech. I would recommend watching the entire thing. The other thing I would recommend watching is last month at Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada gave a very powerful speech about basically how the democratic world needs to start looking beyond the United States because we can no longer rely on the United States because of what's been happening over the last year. I would watch those two speeches back to back, and I think you get a really good sense of where we are today and some of the concerns that I'm mentioning, and frankly, that Eikenberry is mentioning as well. I will say, though, that in some cases, Trump's threats and weaponization of tariffs have worked. Probably his biggest achievement is something that other presidents were not able to do, and that was to get NATO countries to increase their defense spending, which they needed to do. I mean, a lot of American presidents browbeated NATO very politely. Trump was not, and he really got them to up their defense. But I will say, in addition to threats from Trump, the primary motivation for NATO upping their defense was the Russian invasion of Ukraine and realizing that NATO countries are going to have to defend themselves, especially with the possibility that the United States might not show up with Article 5. So there was actually, it wasn't just the use of tariffs, it was the fear that the United States might withdraw its commitments to NATO that inspired NATO countries to increase their defense spending. But increasing the defense spending was something that had to be done anyway. All right, carrying on, almost done here. Um, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright famously called the United States back in the 1990s the indispensable nation. Frankly, I would suggest that Trump is making the United States the unreliable nation. Um, his foreign policy, this term, even more so than in the first term, is personalized, transactional, and erratic. Trump is the first president in American history who adjusts U.S. policy toward countries based on how their leaders treat him personally, positively or negatively. And his foreign policy is, I would argue, non-strategic. It lacks strategic vision beyond a basic quid pro quo transactionalism. Do something for me, and I will do something for you. If you didn't do something for me, I'm going to do something against you. Other than that, there really is no vision, perhaps except for controlling all of what the Western Hemisphere, if you call that a vision. In a recent fit of pique with Canada, Trump just announced, actually, it was either yesterday or today, that now he wants to pull out of the USMCA, which in his first term he called the greatest trade deal ever. He wants to pull out of it because he's mad at Canada. And as we all know right now, he's also threatening to not allow the new Detroit-Windsor Bridge to open. It was paid for by Canada, but he's saying that Canada ripped us off and we want control of the bridge and control of the revenue, or at least half of it, and all these kinds of things. Another dispute with Canada. Canada was probably one of the most reliable allies of the United States. We have the longest undefended border in the world between the U.S. and Canada. Canada is America's largest trading partner. Canada is a primary source of imported oil along with Mexico. Canada was a reliable ally, and now Canadians are boycotting the United States. Not only traveling to the United States, boycotting American goods. I mean, you could not have angered Canadians more than this. And of course, the stereotype of Canadians is that they're polite. They're pretty pissed off right now. And it was a totally, in my view, a self-inflicted wound, an unforced error that did not have to happen, and it keeps happening over and over and over again. Um, uh, Rejecting the prioritization of democracy and democratic alliances, Trump has established what is really becoming a pay-to-play board of peace, and almost all of its members are non-democracies who have joined the board of peace because they want to get favors from Trump. Even his commitment to NATO is transactional and contingent, to use Eikenberry's phrase. Foreign leaders have learned that it's best to flatter Trump and to give him personal gifts in order to get favorable policies. FIFA's Peace Prize, Machado literally giving him her actual Nobel Prize, which still didn't get much favor from him. Qatar giving Trump a $400 million 747, which, by the way, is going to cost probably the United States upwards of $1 billion to refit, to turn it into Air Force One. But then part of the deal is Trump gets to keep the plane after he leaves office. I think this violates the emoluments clause of the Constitution. I think that's been violated multiple times, including in the first term, but nobody seems to be doing that. Again, I cannot stress how unprecedented this is in American history. Um, Many of Trump's actions are financially rewarding to himself, his family, or friends. Trump and the Witkoff families and their children are benefiting personally from foreign policy deals. There's a whole issue of cryptocurrency in which Don Jr. has made about $1 billion with cryptocurrency involved with the person that Trump pardoned. He has also planned the ideas for real estate developments in post-war Gaza that would no doubt benefit him and his family and the Trump Inc. In this sense, I would argue that in many ways, America first is really Trump first. Some final observations. Last slide. As you can see, I have been highly critical of Trump's foreign policy, but I want to stress that this is not from a partisan perspective. It's not anti-Republican. It's not from a Democratic perspective. Trump is tearing apart the post-war international order that was championed and shaped by Republican presidents, Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and the first Bush, as well as Democratic presidents. And even George W. Bush, who definitely took some unilateral actions after 9/11, for the most part operated within the parameters of the liberal international order, especially economically. Republican presidential candidates, John McCain and Mitt Romney, along with Indiana's late elder statesman, Dick Lugar, who was a personal mentor of mine, were also very strong supporters of the American-led, rules-based liberal international order and firmly believed in America's global leadership, as frankly did Senator Marco Rubio when he was in the Senate. Of course, now he's Trump's Secretary of State. And I will say Marco Rubio, when he was in the Senate, was one of the major champions for increasing the funding of USAID, which has now been completely eliminated. I have to stress again, this is not a partisan thing. As a political scientist who's been at this for 35 years now, I can honestly say that no post 1945 Republican president or presidential candidate had such a negative and skeptical view of America's global leadership. All of those Republicans saw the United States as the leader of the free world. Trump has completely, in my view, and in a lot of people's views, including among a lot of Republicans, has abdicated America's role as the leader of the free world. None of these Republican leaders, either from a realist or an idealist perspective, would have taken Russia's side over our Democratic allies, would have taken Russia's side over our NATO partners, or Russia's side over our own intelligence community, all of which Trump has done. In sum, and I'll end with this, in my view, Trump's transactional, egocentric, self-aggrandizing, and disruptive approach to foreign policy and to the global economy is truly unique and unprecedented in American history, either by Republican or Democratic administrations. And there's no other way of getting around it. That's basically what I have to say. I'm glad to take any questions and pushback and hear what you guys have to say. And on that note, I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, Pierre, thank you very much. I did send a note out to everyone. If you do have a question, please post it to our chat room, and we'll call on you in kind of the order that you ask questions. So Louis Sherman had first question up. Louis, you out there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
So I'll try to make this as short as I can. I read Eikenberry and I found it of great interest that the word communism was never mentioned in the article. I believe that's true. He mentioned Soviet Union, maybe the Cold War as you did, but there was really no mention of all of the events around 1945 that led the U.S. to form this kind of international order. And it had very much to do with the anti-communism and to keep the Soviet Union down. People who were born, in the last 50 years or so, certainly in the last 30 or 40 since the Soviet Union fell apart, don't really understand all of this. And so, I think that I can give you many reasons why I think that overall the U.S. has been disserved by things done by the United Nations. So a lot of people have generated an anti feeling against this overall order. So my question is, forget us policy wonks. How do we talk to the general public, the voters, and tell them that Trump is wrong in what he's doing?
Okay, well, first, I'm glad you brought in the historical context. I mean, I talked about it a little bit. I think that maybe in a defense of Eikenberry, I mean, he's really focusing on evaluating Trump's second term policy, America First versus the liberal international order. So he was not going to give the history of it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that was the part of the post-war order. Although I will say, when the Bretton Woods agreements were set up, the World Bank, the IMF, and GATT, which eventually becomes the World Trade Organization, the Soviet Union was invited to join, and they refused. The Soviet Union was invited to actually become part of this global system, and instead they wanted to have their own block, and they wanted to go their own way for obvious reasons. And that basically that really the Cold War breaks out in like around 1947 or so, and then it moves forward. But in terms, first of all, there's a tremendous misunderstanding of the United Nations. A lot of people think the United Nations is a world government. But as I've said in my classes, the United Nations is a collection of member states. There is no higher power in the international system than the sovereign state. And that is something, even with the liberal international order, ultimately sovereignty still is supreme. You have norms and you have rules, but especially powerful countries are able to break those rules. Okay. I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine. There are sanctions, but basically everything that's being done against Russia largely is being done by other sovereign states. There is no overarching world government. A lot of people think that there is, and so the belief that the UN is a world government that's going to take away our sovereignty, that's led to that misinformation has led to a lot of misunderstandings and all of that. Black helicopters that's been around for a long time. So I think part of it has to be just sort of an education of it. The UN is also, when you're talking about 193 member states, anything that large is going to be problematic. And that, and even the Security Council has its own problems, because of course, one country can veto, one of the five can veto anything, right? And so they'll always veto in their own self-interest because countries are acting out of self-interest from a realist perspective.
That's actually a minor point. What are the
Yeah.
positive points that you want to make that would get many of the voters who voted for Trump? He got over 50% to say that he's wrong. He should not overturn this order.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm not sure if everybody voting for Trump, that was what they were thinking. But
Yes.
the United States has definitely benefited from all of this. I mean, if you think about the level of peace in the world, the leadership, the trade, the question, what I would say is it's not so much is it good or is it bad, but what I say rather than withdrawing from it and rather than shrinking, the United States should play a leadership role in perhaps helping to redesign things. If there are things that aren't working well, how can we fix them? As opposed to saying we're going to take our marbles and go home. And again, one of the real issues is, and this is something that say John McCain talked about when before he died, and he started when he was running for president as well, but even later was the UN, because there's so many countries, and a lot of those countries are non-democratic. A lot of those countries are openly hostile to the United States. What he said is we should not abandon the United Nations, but we should create a parallel, stronger organization of a League of Democracies, of the democratic world. Because frankly, we're the ones that matter, and we're the ones that, and basically, and bring in a lot of democracies, including countries that are sort of not really fully in, like India, for example, that really need to be there. But that's going in that was a kind of a liberal internationalist view from a Republican perspective, but basically saying America will play a leadership role of the democratic world. Okay, and that way we can sort of divorce ourselves from some of the countries we don't like, and then the countries that are openly hostile to the United States. But I would say what's really unusual, very unusual in this case, is the president who's basically spends more time attacking democracies than he does criticizing authoritarian regimes. And that is just that's strange. I mean, that's just bizarre. And I think the traditional foreign policy Republicans are still kind of trying to get their head around that. That's just a very unusual thing, and there's no real rational reason for that. But that really undermines America's interests and America's values. Yeah. So, but again, I would say that try and fix it rather than walk away from it because we benefit from it. We get much more out of it than what we put into it, I would argue.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Shelby Carter, you out there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Dr. Atlas, I'm actually one of your students currently at IU Indianapolis right now.
Yes. Yes.
And so one of the things that I had to figure out how to craft this question in a way that didn't seem overly critical. But um, we discuss often that, especially in your former class that I had you with, our drive for being in wars in the first place was to push our ideals, was to hopefully have those countries that we work with eventually to adopt democracy. And so, do you think that, as you mentioned, Trump has not mentioned that at all? This has not been a pillar of his administration. Do you think that that could be because we're not seeing the results of recent wars and conflicts in that regard? We're not seeing them start to adopt those ideals that we introduce. So do you see a correlation there at all?
That's a good question. I think, I mean, really the two examples where that it didn't work. Well, actually, the one example where it really didn't work was Afghanistan. Iraq is semi-democratic. I mean, they've had elections and they have a it's not a very functional democracy, although every democracy has its own problems, including our own. But I think if you go back again to the democracy in Asia, whether it's South Korea or Japan, in Europe, elsewhere, I think that we could make a different case that it did work. The bottom line is going to war to force a country to become democratic is not the right way of doing it. And I think that was definitely a lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I don't think that anybody seriously would propose anymore moving forward that we should do that. And in fact, that was a lot of pushback against Trump when he went into Venezuela was, is this going to be regime change? And there was a lot of pushback within MAGA as well as from outside from the left as well. We don't want to do this again. And it turns out that really wasn't what it was about. It was really we removed the leader, but the vice president is now in charge, and she says, as far as she's concerned, he's still the leader. But the idea of going to war to achieve democracy, that I don't think we're going to hear that rhetoric from anybody. The irony is, though, that Trump basically had said that it wasn't just about going to war; it was about this idea of using force. We're going to be much more focused on the United States, but he likes to fire missiles, I would say, and things like that. I mean, so we have multiple cases like this and threats, and he really likes to use the American military. Because frankly, the American military is the best in the world. I mean, no military can do what we can do, including taking out what we did in Venezuela, what we did in Iran, and the one sure thing he can do with positive results tactically is to tell the military to do something to take out this target, and they will take it out, and in a very usually in a very brilliant way. And so I think he's sort of starting to rely on that as a foreign policy tool without much vision of what he wants to do beyond it. And I think, to what extent people within his own movement are going to not like that, I'm not sure. But so far, he's not engaging in any massive invasions the way George W. Bush did, for example, which was very critical of, at least afterwards. I don't know if that addressed your question or not, but
Yeah, no, it did. I think that just there's I know a lot of my family and friends and people I know who did vote for him all three times spoke very highly of his ability to administer like a businessman. And as a lot of times people in business will say, well, since this didn't work when we did it last time, why would we try to do it again? So that's kind of where that question came from of just could this be the business side of things? Could this just be we're going to govern like a business? But no, so it was mostly, yeah, I would say so. So thank you very much.
sure, sure.
All right. Well, thank you. Renee, I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name there. Are you next? You there? No? Okay. Jack Gannon, you've got a question.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Atlas, Pierre, I have a question for you. It appears to me that some of the actions that have been taken that would be considered in violation of the the liberal international order could be remedied by a future president, such as getting back into the WHO, getting back as a participant in the World Climate Treaty. But what about permanent damage that's been inflicted? Could you speak to that? Are there things that have happened that just aren't reparable, things that we just can't go back to in terms of the liberal international order?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think probably the deepest damage is a loss of trust in the United States, and reliability. You're absolutely right. I mean, we saw, I mean, when Biden came in, he literally got back into everything that Trump pulled out of, and then when Trump came back in again, he basically undid everything Biden did, and that happens a lot, by the way. Lots of presidents do that. I mean, that's very easy. But even as different administrations have done that, there was a large consistency in terms, as I've said, over 80 years across administrations in terms of what America's general role was, especially with our allies. And I think that one of the real things is that Europe has come to the understanding that they can no longer rely on the United States. That the United States, that when they call 911, the United States might not come. Now, maybe that could be a good thing. I mean, frankly, Europe going its own way, the European Union may perhaps finally coming up with a common defense policy and a common foreign policy, that's probably a good thing ultimately. But the idea that the transatlantic alliance has been damaged, and I think it's going to be very difficult to reestablish that. And also the idea of America as the indispensable nation. A lot of people now are people looking at for alternatives. We are increasingly a multipolar world as opposed to a bipolar world. It's not even just the U.S. and China. I mean, basically, there's going to be so many more power centers, and a lot of countries are going to start thinking about what can we do without the United States. And Canada's doing that right now. There's even been like semi-joking, not serious, but I'm sure some people are sort of like starting to contemplate the idea of Canada joining the European Union, which would be a very strange thing. But that's not going to happen, I don't think. But this idea of shifting away from the United States by countries that had always sort of assumed that the United States had their back, and the United States was part of the system, was a leader of the system. And I think that's going to be very difficult to overcome because what we saw is how fragile it is. It's just like at the individual level, just among all of us, we all know, it takes a long time to build up trust, and you can lose it in a minute. And then how do you rebuild it? And I think that's going to be one of the aspects. And it really is forcing other countries to look beyond the United States. And that may be, like I said, that might be a good thing. But I don't think in the long run that's going to be in the best interest of the United States or of the democratic world either.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jack. I'll read Renee's question. I'm not sure where she went, but she said, being a student of international relations, I believe that the United States is under the leadership of Trump is isolating the U.S. Unfortunately, he is not an idealist nor a racist. He is isolating the U.S. from white Europe, isolating from Christian Latin America. What do you think his real foreign policy objectives are?
I kind of hinted at that, I think, or maybe not hinted in my presentation. I think a lot of his, I can't get into his head, obviously, but I think a lot of his foreign policy, as with his domestic policy, is driven by self-interest and grievance, and this idea of a quid pro quo, that people who are good to me, I will be good to them. People who are bad to me, I will be bad to them. People who don't show me respect, I will step on them. I mean, I think a lot of it is like that. It's a very self-serving, a very transactional approach, which is always very short term. And I think from that perspective, I don't think he has a broad view. I think there are some specific beliefs he has that we can actually see going back decades. One is a very much strongly anti-immigration, especially immigration by people of color. I think that's something that goes all the way back, to the 1970s. There's a lot of prejudice, I think, towards people of color that going back to when, he and his father were landlords in New York and they got sued for denying apartments to black people, things like that. I mean, I think there's been that for a very long time. I really do think that he believes that the United States is being ripped off. That if anybody, and again, he comes at it. This is his I think his misunderstanding of business, is that everything is a zero-sum game. This idea that if you're making money, it must be at at my expense. And he looks at the entire world that way. But a fund, and that's the mercantilist understanding of economic nationalism. But the whole fundamental concept of capitalism, of the free market, going back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo, is that economics and trade is not a zero-sum game; it's a positive-sum game. We're not fighting over slices of the pie. Trade makes the pie larger. And he doesn't seem to understand that. And I think that that's a major aspect. But beyond things like that, beyond sort of like this quid pro quo transactionalism and very strong attitudes about, I think, about race and immigration and things like that, and also the idea of absolute power, that he should basically not be checked, that as president he should be able to do whatever he wants. I think he really would like to be a king. I think that's one reason why he's so much more comfortable with authoritarian dictators than he is with democratic leaders around the world. I think it's also why he does not like multilateral agreements. I don't know if you've noticed that. Any type of multilateral organization or multilateral agreement he doesn't like. He wants everything bilateral because he wants it to be him and a person sitting across the table from him where he can make a deal. He does not like being one among six people in a room. And so he tries to pull the United States out of multilateral organizations and agreements, and he wants to replace them with bilateral. And that's something that's happening as well. I think those are sort of like maybe values or attitudes that sort of shape how he conducts foreign policy. But I do not believe he has a grand vision. I don't believe there's any sort of strategy really to his foreign policy. I could be wrong. I mean, maybe there is. But my sense is that the factors I identified, I think that's really what sort of drives it.
All right, thank you. Nicole, you're next in line here.
Yeah, hi. My camera's not working, but I'm also a student of yours this semester. I asked basically the people that voted for Trump, knowing what he was capable of, maybe not knowing the specifics of what was going to happen over the course of the last year, but still on his side. Do you think that they want a democracy, or do you think that they want to live under this authoritarian structure, or do you think that they are unaware of what they're supporting? There's also that also begs the question that what Trump is doing and the people that are following him, they are benefiting in a way from his system in some aspects, but not all. That would be my question is, do you think that they want to live in a free country, I guess? Yeah,
Okay. Well, I can't get into Trump's head, so I certainly cannot get into the head of everybody who voted for Trump. I
sure,
think
sure.
first of all, I think that people voted for Trump for multiple reasons, and I don't think it's fair to basically suggest that everybody voted for Trump for one particular reason. I mean, there are some people
Yeah.
who are single issue voters. They voted for Trump because of abortion. There are people who voted for Trump just because of the Second Amendment. There are people who voted for Trump because they wanted lower taxes. There are people who voted for Trump because they wanted mass deportation. All these different kinds of things, right? And there, so I think there's a whole, there's a conglomeration of all of this stuff. It's sort of a coalition, I guess. I think that there is clearly some percentage, I would not guess as to what, there is clearly a percentage of Americans who would be willing to forego democracy in order to have a regime that basically benefits people who look like them against others, perhaps who are of a particular class or whatever. I think there's always
Mhm.
been a percentage of Americans like that throughout American history. I think what has happened with Donald Trump, one of the things that's happened is that he has given voice to those people, and he's basically given to a lot of different people with different ideas that might have been considered marginal or fringe, and he's basically made them feel comfortable coming out of the woodwork and doing that. And I think that that's one element, but I don't know how large a percentage that is. Okay, I think
Mhm.
there are other people who firmly do believe in democracy, and if Trump loses an election, then he loses an election. But clearly, there are people who don't, who went on January 6th and things like that. I can't get into their
Mhm.
head, but I think I'm afraid I think there are some people who are that way, but that predates Trump. We've always had a John Birch Society. We've always had these types of things, very conspiratorial, all this kind of stuff. But I think he's sort of empowered and given voice to some of those people. And it's going to be really interesting to see when Trump leaves. Um, I was on a thing a couple nights ago with Adam Kinzinger, and the way he put it, which I totally agree, is that after Trump leaves, there's going to be a civil war within the Republican Party. Trump is in many ways the leader of a cult. He's like a cult leader, I think, and there are people who will follow him no matter what he does. And when he changes his opinion from one day to the next, they change their opinion as well. But after he's gone, after his term expires and he's no longer there, I don't think there's anybody that has the dynamism and charisma of Donald Trump that can hold the MAGA coalition together. And I think it's just going to completely splinter. And at that point, that might actually lead to some of the concerns we have about what might happen with democracy. Perhaps those concerns might dissipate after him because I
Yeah,
don't think you're going to have anybody who's going to be able to rally people the way he does.
sure.
All right. Thank you,
Thank
Nicole.
you. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Betty, you're up.
When Biden was elected in 2000 and he started going back to Europe to meetings, he was warmly welcomed, embraced. They knew him. They probably thought, oh, good, welcome back. And he might have forgiven us. We're 250 years old. People live in houses older than that. And they thought, well, you had a hiccup. You're still the American experiment. But we did it again. We brought him back. And I think we must have a proclivity for doing this. What do you envision? Because they can't wait. They're going to move on. They're going to create trade deals, different alliances. What do you think when we get through this and in the next 28, if we can um, restore our relations again? And what do you think our relationship will we be a world leader, the world leader? Will we will we slide back into relationships, or will it be something different? I felt after Bad Bunny was bringing America into the bigger picture the other night, I thought, well, that's kind of cool. We think of America as United States, but no, I mean, and what if there's a great opportunity there to really interact in marvelous ways we've not done before?
Mhm.
And that might be kind of interesting. But what do you envision, Pierre? And we'll get to
Um,
28 and we'll be here,
yeah.
but what's that gonna, it's not gonna be the old way. People won't feel there, they will moved on, the hiccups will happen again. So what's our opportunity? What's the
Well, I think I think the United States is not going to be as relevant in the future to the world as it is today, or as it has been since World War II. And we are already, like I said, in a multipolar world, and we're just not going to be. There used to be a saying: when the United States sneezes, the world catches a cold. Okay.
right.
That's not going to be the
Mhm.
case anymore. We're still going to have the most powerful military in the world. We're still going to have the largest economy in the world. Maybe China will surpass us, although I'm not so sure. We have a a dynamic economy and miserable politics. And
Yeah.
we sort of muddle along. And we've done that for a while now. But I don't think we're going to be the same as we were. As I said in my presentation, Madeleine Albright used to call us the indispensable nation. We're the unreliable one now. And I think there's going to be a, a skepticism no matter who comes in next, whoever the president is, can we trust it? Okay, because I think what the world saw was how easy it was for the United States to turn on a dime and basically retreat from the world, and retreat from democracy abroad and perhaps even at home as well. I mean, it was a shock, and I think the point you made up is a really good point. When Biden won in 2020, as he said himself, he went to the Europeans and to the world. He said, "We're back." Okay,
Mhm.
and there was a sigh of relief. And it was, yeah, you're right. It was a hiccup. It was okay. The nightmare is over. It's a quote, Gerald Ford. America's nightmare is over, right? But when Trump got reelected, and then not only did he get reelected, but he brought in a completely different cadre of cabinet members with no guardrails, of yes men and women who have no inclination of stopping on anything. I think it wasn't just a shock about Trump. I think for the world it was a shock about America.
Mhm.
That how could America do this? People around the world looked up to America, even if they didn't like American policies, even if they talked about the ugly American, even if America was doing nasty things, which we've done as well. Okay, people were still literally dying to get into the United States. America was like was this it represented the shining city on a hill for a lot of people around the world, not just for the Pilgrims or Ronald Reagan. I mean, it really was that. And I think that that our shining city has been completely tarnished, and I don't think we're ever going to get that shine back.
Ooh,
I really don't. Um, as I said, there could be a positive to that in the sense that we will no longer be expected to be the world's policeman.
yeah.
Other, especially other democracies will rise up, which I think is very important. What's really important is that if the United States pulls back or the United States sinks back, that a China or a Russia does not fill the vacuum. That's what really is important. And we don't
Mhm.
want China or Russia, these non-democratic countries, and China with a dynamic economy, Russia does not have one. We don't want them taking our place. But if it's a multipolar world with the European Union and India and other countries around the world that are having more influence, and we'll still be probably the first among equals, just given the size of our military and the size of our economy, and still the size of our democracy. I think we'll still play a major role, but we're not going to be the indispensable nation, and the world is not going to get cold when we sneeze anymore.
Yeah.
And I think to go back to the earlier question, I think that's going to be the long term. I hope I'm wrong, by the way. I'd be very happy to be wrong, but I think it's going to be the long term effect of what's been happening. And I think what's really shocked the world as well as a lot of Americans is just how fast this has happened.
Yeah.
Within 1 year, even within a few months, just how quickly everything changed. And
Well,
that
you
really
would
makes
use the
people
word,
realize, what, my God, I mean, we cannot rely on America anymore,
right.
even for the
You use the
values that
word,
America stands for. That's my interpretation.
yeah. You would use the word fragile, and others have as well. That democracy is fragile.
Mm.
It is. It takes it like when Ben Franklin said, "I gave you republic. We gave you republic if you can keep it."
Yep. Yep.
But a commentator had said fairly early on, a month or so into Trump's second term, um, Andrew Weisel, I believe, that it shocked him as he saw things begin to deteriorate very quickly, how shallow the democracy was, not fragile. And I know you and I discussed it a little bit because you said, no, I still think fragile. And that was the first time I had heard or even thought the word shallow, which made me think that I don't know how many Americans, I spent a lot of time in my classes since they're all history and government, and we go over the founding documents, the Constitution, the Declaration, the amendments, because when people take those, they're in early grades and they don't
Yeah.
really have America, the dissent all over the Declaration. What kind of dissent does a school child have? How do they understand those concepts? And I think Americans take them to read these too young that they really don't even have a grasp of the founding documents. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't know, and we've taken what we have for granted that's being violated the way that it is. I don't really think is sinking in.
I would say, yeah, I wouldn't actually, if I said the word fragile, I mean, I think it is fragile. But the
Yeah.
way I've put it in the past in some of my classes too is I see democracy, and by the way, this is not just in the United States, but democracy in general. Democracy
Mhm.
is a delicate fabric.
Mhm.
And if you start pulling at the strings, you can unravel it. It's actually because democracy is based on trust, political trust and tolerance and norms of behavior. And if you start undermining those things, the democracy can collapse. And I think what's been really unusual about Trump, unlike all presidents in American history, from either party or from any party, is that Trump has gleefully pulled at the threads of
Yes.
democracy,
Yes.
deliberately done so
Mhm.
in the first term and even more so in the second term.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'll just say this. I know we're almost out of time, but going back to 2016, to the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump in every single campaign in 2016, 2020, and 2024 said before the voting that if I lose, it means the election was rigged. If I lose, it means the other side cheated. No presidential candidate in American history has ever said that. Not the idea that let the chips fall where they may. The only way I can lose is if you guys cheated or if the election is rigged. He said that in 2016. He won, so no problem. He said it in 2020. He lost. The election was rigged. We got January 6th. He said it again going into 2024. He won, no problem. But the idea of saying that is so fundamentally anti-democratic with a small d, anti-democratic. and that it undermines the most basic elements of democracy. And I cannot, I mean, literally from the day he began his campaign, he was talking in that term, and it was I've never in my lifetime and in my understanding of American history, and I've read going back to the Federalist Papers too, never has as a presidential candidate ever used that kind of language to that totally undermines the values of democracy and of our republic from the moment he started running for president 10 years ago. And this is but again, I mean, after 2028, he's gone. And then hopefully Republicans will nominate someone and Democrats will nominate someone who believes in the norms of democracy. And we will start to restore the United States, both domestically and internationally, and maybe rebuild some trust.
One
But
final question to
rebuilding
you.
trust is hard and it takes a long time.
One final question as a political scientist to you is, do you have any concerns or fears that there might be a demand while he is in power and while he does have MAGA out there, and even though we're seeing it begin to fray and over the Epstein files, I'm all sick of hearing them, but do you think that there'll be a demand and a successful demand for we have the amendments to amend the Constitution, but will there be a valid attempt to really write a new Constitution? Or is that just too far-fetched?
No. I mean, the Constitution. I don't think we're going to see an amendment to the Constitution in our lifetimes, you and me, and maybe not. I mean, the Constitution is so difficult to amend. It's not going to happen. And
I'm
I
not
think
talking
what's
about
happening
amendment,
now.
I'm talking about writing anew.
No, you'd have to have a constitutional convention to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, no, that's even more difficult. No, that's not going to happen. I think what's more likely what we've been seeing is the undermining of norms, and traditions, and that sort of erode people's faith in democracy. Telling people that you can't trust the election, that can destroy democracy without changing the Constitution. And I think those are serious issues. But I think one thing that is that so many things he's done so much in the past year, but he's done so many things that have upset so many Americans from different perspectives, from different ideological perspectives, different parties. I think he's losing a lot of his shine right now.
Mhm.
Whether it's Epstein or Minneapolis,
Right.
or the shooting of the boats. I mean, all the different kinds of things that have been going on. There's so many different people, including a lot of people who supported him in the past, are saying, "Wait a minute, maybe he's gone too far." The corruption is massive. I mean, the level of corruption with his family. I mean, they've made billions of dollars over his presidency. I think there's so many things that are happening that piece by piece, perhaps like death by salami slices, you're going to get to the point where his support is going to reduce, and all of that. I think that could happen. But the damage that he's done is going to. I think the damage he's done can last long after he's left.
Oh, yes.
And it's going to take a lot of rebuilding,
Yeah.
including within the Republican Party. They've got a lot of damage to rebuild as well.
One of the things that's really critical, Pierre, when we talk about elections again and voting, is getting people to vote because of that lack of trust.
Yeah.
And young people in particular, they have known nothing but this Trump era, and they don't want any more. They want an amendment to my students want an amendment to the Constitution that says no more old white men, no one over 75.
No, that's yeah.
Yeah, but
It's two-thirds of the Senate, two-thirds of the House, and three-fifths of the states to amend the Constitution.
yeah,
It's not going to happen.
It's arduous, very arduous.
Yeah.
But they do and what I do think is hope for participation of young people, which is going to be critical to keep a democracy going, is that they vote. They like the ranked choice voting because they feel right now between twiddly-dee and twiddly-da between the two parties, but they like the ranked choice. That makes them feel like I have some control of my vote. But don't the
Were there any other questions?
Yeah, actually, we could.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought we were wrapping up here.
There was one question. D. Wimhoff, I don't know if you're still out there. I could read your question for you if you're still there. That was sort of the last question.
I am here, actually.
Okay.
My question is this. It seems to me that there is a very large, foreign policy establishment, if that's the right word, that is still extant, still in existence, despite Trump's regime, which I call it a regime because it is so alien to America. I think it's very alien to our whole way of thinking and acting and viewing the world. And I have some ideas on why it's alien. But is this American foreign policy establishment still there? Will they be able to step in and continue with these ideas, the international liberal order, which was a brilliant idea, which really brought people together and brought peace and worked for the whole world? So do you see that foreign policy establishment stepping back in and becoming involved once the Trump regime is removed or leaves?
I mean, there are I mean, there are a lot of Republicans who were in the traditional, foreign policy establishment, as you say. I mean, one of the questions is going to be after Trump, again, what direction does the Republican Party go in? I mean, frankly, I have to say, before Trump's presidency, Marco Rubio was a kind of a rising star in the Republican Party on the foreign policy side. And when he ran in 2016, he was one of the candidates in 2016. He was like the adult in the room when it came to foreign policy, very much from a Republican internationalist perspective. But he has gone. I mean, and again, he's well, I don't know what he actually believes. I can't get into his head either. I personally think he knows better than what he's doing. But he has gone full MAGA as Secretary of State and as National Security Advisor. What's going to happen afterwards? One of the problems is I think that a lot of the people who were in the Trump administration, when this is over, especially if the Republican Party doesn't, if MAGA falls apart after Trump, a lot of the people who are in the administration are going to be so tarnished that they're going to be radioactive, especially if they followed the line and did this. We'll see. I could be totally wrong. It could be that they'll be the heroes, right? There is sort of that establishment, but within the party itself, there's a very strong anti-establishment sentiment. That if you were part of the old Republican establishment, you're the guys who got us into Iraq, you're the guys who got us into Afghanistan. You have no credibility whatsoever. So we'll see what happens, right? I also think that again, if America doesn't regain a lot of the trust, there might be an opening for a more serious America first kind of thing, where it's maybe a little bit more isolationist. And again, I don't think that's necessarily the best thing, but that might happen too. So, what type of foreign policy establishment is there going to be? Is it going to be what we're talking about, the liberal international order, or is America's role in that pretty much going to end? Especially if a Republican comes into the presidency, like J.D. Vance, at this point, it's really hard to tell what his own beliefs are because he's basically mimicking whatever Trump says. If he becomes the president, he'll be his own person, maybe a little bit of post MAGA. He's a smart guy. Maybe he will have a different understanding of the world than Trump did. I don't know. But we'll have to wait and see what happens. That's not much of an answer. Sorry.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank everyone for your questions. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Betty to say goodnight.
I'm sorry to go on. I thought we were wrapping up. But Claire, what was your question about the Olympics and booing?
Yeah, well, I think that the world is getting very tired of Donald Trump, his antics at the UN and Davos. And I noticed at the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, J.D. Vance was there and he got booed, but they were also booing the American athletes. They
I didn't
were.
hear that. Let me interrupt. I didn't actually watch it, but I read that there was actually loud cheering for the American athletes and then booing for J.D. Vance. That's what I
Well,
heard. I didn't see it, but
the Canadian broadcasters picked up some booing of the American athletes.
okay.
Um, but I follow ice skating. I'm not an expert, but yesterday I saw the American team of ice dancers that were favored to win. And but every element, I'm looking at the grading in the upper left-hand corner, they were judged so harshly. And of course, it doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they got silver instead of gold. The French got gold. But I felt like there's something political about this. And it doesn't mean anything other than their endorsements in the future. Maybe they don't get a picture of themselves on a box of Wheaties, but and none of the broadcasters are saying anything about that, and everybody's trying to be a good sport, even though they have to fight back tears in their interviews, and they don't say anything about Trump. But I just feel like they were graded down because of Trump.
It
And
could be. That
yeah,
could be. Although I will say I mean, I haven't been watching the Olympics this year, but in the past, it always struck me that that ice skaters were those the arbitrariness of the grading was always
mhm.
there. I could never understand how they did things, but it could very well be that this is a way of maybe particular judges to sort of lash out and make a statement. That's unfortunate if they're taking it out on the athletes. That shouldn't happen. But yeah, I mean that could very well be.
Yeah, it's
Um,
very subjective.
no,
And
it's very the ice skating, all that whole area is incredibly subjective when it comes to the judging. And yeah, there's always been things like that going back years. Um, well, I guess Ray, I guess that's it.
That's it. Thank you. We've had some students tonight, and I want to remind students your membership is free in the at ICWA. And that's really a cool deal. Because that was going to give you, and you're well, membership is free, and for a student into through college, you can attend the programs for free. But what you also get is a global post. So for any of you who are thinking about membership, a membership would cut your attending our programs in half and give you the global post, which is a very it's informative, it's credible, excellent contributions from experts in the field. And it's not a long read every day. It's just a good snapshot of the major timely and urgent foreign matters of the day. So please consider it, and please come back and see us next Wednesday. We are going to be talking about Ukraine and Europe. Almost all of our programs this Great Decisions year is really about hot points. Ukraine and Europe, no one's talking about it right now, which is really sad. And we're going to have a woman come back who's been with us before, Erin Roosevelt, who is a really profound expert. She spends half of her time between here and Europe at The Hague, dealing with matters at one of the courts in The Hague. And the moderator for her is going to be, I can't think of her name right now, but Janet, what is her name and her title? She's here in Indianapolis, but she's like the emissary. What is her name?
Yes, Dr. Svetlana Raymer, and she is Ukraine's honorary consul to the state of Indiana. And
So it's
also,
gonna be-
she's founder and president of the Ukrainian Society of Indiana.
yeah.
Very articulate and educated individual. I think you'll enjoy her.
Yeah, she's going to be great. So it's going to a great moderator, both bringing a tremendous amount of passion for Ukraine, and she is Ukrainian. So please come back. That's going to be next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And thank you for coming, Pierre. You were wonderful. Thank you as always. We probably should have made you logger night, where we took a pause and we went to our loggers and got whatever we wanted and came back and discussed, because this was a topic I think a lot of us want to talk about. So thank you. Thank you all for coming and for your fabulous questions. And please come back and see us. And thank you for being great supporters of Great Decisions.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.